how do we know there was no Hamzah and that it
Mm,
was added later? And what does
mhm,
that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? Just
mhm, mhm.
imagining that there's no Hamzah in the Arabic language for me was mind blowing.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a really interesting question. It's once again a nice example where really looking at different reading traditions gives a different perspective. But how do we do this? So let's first talk about, for listeners along, what is a hamza? Hamza is what we in English call a glottal stop. It's the as in glottal, um, and it's in the word mu'min, for example, or bi'r, or um, shay at the end, or sama. And if you look at what the grammarians tell us about Hijazi dialect, um, they tell us time and time again the Hijazis had no Hamza, unlike the Najdis or unlike others who did have it. So instead of saying mu'min, the Hijazi said mu'min, and instead of bi'r, they said bir. Um, and instead of yas'alu, they said yas'al. And that fact is reflected in the orthography. And this is something that we've noticed for a long time. When you write mu'min, you don't write, you write mim, waw, mim, nun. And that's an unusual spelling because if we look at pre-Islamic Arabic, and this is where this comes into play, what letter do they use to write Hamza? They use the Alif. So a word like mu'min, you'd expect it to be written mim, alif, mim, nun, if it was really pronounced mu'min. So it looks like it is writing mu'min, but the reading traditions, some of them at least, read it as mu'min. And so just going by the orthography, you already go like, well, it's clearly at least intended to write a dialect that doesn't have Hamza. But just because it's using an orthography that is meant for something that doesn't have Hamza, doesn't mean the language of the Qur'anic composition doesn't have Hamza. So that's those are two different things, right? Spelling can be different from pronunciation. So how do you show that what the orthography, so the spelling seems to show that is actually what the language of the Quran does? Well, to get at that, you have to start looking at rhyme. And what you will see in rhyme, there's not many places. There's like 4 or 5, maybe a bit more, of words where if you drop the hamza, the rhyme works better. So this is in Surah 55, I think, where sha'n rhymes with tukadhiban, which works much better if it rhymes as shan tukadhiban, right?
Mm.
And that's exactly what you'd expect. That's what the spelling seems to suggest. And there's a couple of other cases like this where you can kind of play around with these different options, where every time you look, the rhyme works better without the hamza. So that really suggests that the rhyme seems to suggest that what the orthography is representing is indeed what is in the language. Now, there's this pervasive idea, well, but the Quran obviously had hamza because, we open up a Quran and there's hamza in there. It's very important to note that the letter that we know as hamza did not exist at the time, and they had no way of writing it. So, it really had to be added, which is why you still write it as a waw, but you write a little hamza on top, or you write alif with a little hamza on top. It's an extra sign, a sign that gets invented in maybe the 2nd or 3rd century Hijri. We don't really know when it happens. The earliest texts that we have it, except for the Quran. But that's, those are mid 3rd century. So, and where was I going? Oh yeah. And so this, and indeed, Hafs has a very conservative pronunciation of the Hamza in his recitation, although not in all places. There's one place he drops the Hamza where most other readers keep it, which is in Kufuwan. That's in Surah Al-Ikhlas. You will probably have learned to recite it as Kufuwan, but it's Kufu'an in most other recitations, actually all of them. So Kufu'an is unique to Hafs. So not even the other transmitter of Asim, Shoba, reads Kufu'an. He reads Kufu'an too. So this is a very nice example where, even when we take all the rules and talk about the standard, there's a place where, Hafs is not behaving like standard classical Arabic. But of course, because we all assume that this is the standard, we think, oh, that's a normal form. But when you think about it, it's a very strange form. What kind of noun would that be? What kind of noun ends in u? Those don't exist in Arabic. There are words that end in u with a hamza, so those do exist. So, but then if you start looking at other reading traditions, you'll see, you know, Warsh reads mu'min, he doesn't read mu'min. Abu Ja'far reads mu'min, doesn't read mu'min. Abu Amr has as an option to read mu'min and can also read mu'min, depends on what he feels like, basically. So those forms exist, and no single canonical reading tradition has no hamza at all. But there's a good chance that there were reading traditions around. Now that brings me to the second part of your question that you had. What does that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? Yeah, what does it? What does that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? That's an interesting question and a difficult question. Although I think the Islamic tradition is very kind of robust against an attack, if we want to call it that, from this direction. Because if we think about it, these things don't matter, right? A mu'min and a mu'min are the same thing. That's not very important. So linguistically, I mean, I get excited about hamzas, but I can totally understand that people are like, well, why is this guy so excited about hamzas? And so there's this tradition within the Islamic tradition, you know, from the Prophet, who then says that the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, 7 modes, words, letters, edges, who knows? We don't really know what this word means. But what's very clear from the context of this hadith, and it's a very early hadith, it's very clear, it's very early. What's clear from this hadith is that it's about oral variation, about differences between reciters. So, and the Prophet, in a sense, giving an allowance to recite the Quran in multiple ways. Now, how literally you take that? You know, did the Prophet really recite every single word in every single way possible? Or did he just say, well, you know, this guy can recite in that way, and that guy can recite in that way, and it's all fine, and that lady can recite in another way? You know, that's kind of something you can play with, but there's clearly kind of an allowance for this kind of variation. And these kinds of questions is not what the Quran in its essence is about. And so when linguistic norms start shifting and what kinds of things these reciters were, let's say, exposed to, they would go every now and then and say, you know what, I will, you know, recite this word with a hamza, or I'll start reciting the whole Quran with hamzas, or I'll do this or I'll do that. And there's a kind of selection procedure, and what the readers are doing is really a kind of selection. It's a kind of intellectual exercise, right? They are trying to make the Quran beautiful, which I think they see as, you know, their religious duty, and they think maybe the Quran is more beautiful with hamza. Why those kinds of things shift, that's ultimately a social linguistic question. It's kind of hard to really get at. But it's not, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no oral tradition. If you would ask me, well, did, you know, the Prophet really recite and teach every single variant that is in the reading traditions? I think that's very unlikely. But I think that's taking too literally what this is about, because then we talk about, you know, hundreds of thousands, well, that's not right, but tens of thousands of permutations. It's like, well, did he really go with every single time that he said alayhum? He said, well, you can also say alayhim, and in this verse you can also say alayhimu, and in this verse you can also say alayhimi, and you know, you can go and just explode the amount of variants, and that's just within the canon. Then you can also go outside of the canon where there's even more things which have perfectly good isnads, and you know, it's all good. So how do you go about this? Well, you know, you can kind of play around with this, but ultimately there is a text, there's a written text that's very important. I think within the transmission of the Quran, there are parts where, well, we might get into in a second. And there's ways of reciting this, and there's ways of reciting that are all Arabic, according to grammarians. They say, well, this, you can say this, you can say that, and it's all fine. And as long as it's all Arabic, it all kind of follows the language of the Quran in that sense. It doesn't follow the language of the Quran probably as the Prophet recited it, or his closest companions did, who were all Hijazis, but it is Arabic, and it's not fundamentally changing the message of the text. So that was a kind of leeway they had, and I think really purposely exploited. They wanted to use that leeway to kind of, play around with questions of language.